Hello everyone, this is my proof of concept for hot swappable control panels for Arcade1Up cabinet. So how this idea came about, for a while I've been thinking about building a multicade. I built multicades before and I'm planning on building another one towards the end of the year. And one of the things I wanted to do was create hot swappable control panels. That way, because I had the mod I'm going to do is for an Arcade1Up cabinet, which I believe is a Gen 1. So my plan was to create, control panels I could pop off and put back on, or figure out a way to do it. So before that project, I'm actually building out 4 Gen 1 cabinets that I had and putting legacy PCBs in them, being the Capcom Legacy, Midway Legacy, Napco Legacy, and the Atari Legacy PCBs that I acquired. So as I was building out the Midway Legacy, I started to play Defender, and although the Arcade1Up controls are fine for Defender the way they are, I just wanted to play it like it was in the arcade with the original control panel how it was laid out, or at least as close to it as I could. So that brought the thought again to a hot swappable control panel. So as you can see in this video, I actually found a way to do it. This is just my way of doing it. I'm not sure if I'm sure others have done this as well, but this is the way I did it, and I just wanted to show people how I did it to give anyone ideas if they wanted to do it, or they can even improve on it. But I just wanted to go through how I did it and and then at the end of this video show you a demonstration of swapping out all the control panels and playing in gameplay. Now, to accomplish hot swappable control panels for the Arcade1Up, I needed to think about what exactly needed to be done to accomplish this. And I came up with 5 things, at least for me, to accomplish it. So the first thing, I needed to cut and produce art for the control panel myself. Now this part is optional. Now you can use the actual Arcade1Up control panel, or you can buy it from other vendors, third-party vendors and whatnot. But for me, I needed to cut and produce my own art because when I do my Multicade mod, I'm going to be creating more control panels. So it would be nice for me just to be able to make my own and produce the art. And that way I can do it quickly and not have to wait on a vendor. So the second thing I thought of, I'll need to find an alternative for the screws that hold the control panel in place. I don't want to have to keep unscrewing and screwing back in the control panel every single time that I want to play a game. So I want to find an alternative where those screws where I can just pop it off and put it back on without having to unscrew it from the cabinet itself, and to also make sure that if I do that method that it's actually secure and it's not going to fly off while I'm playing. So the next thing I thought about was I'm going to have to relocate the Arcade1Up encoder board off the control panel and put it in the cabinet somewhere. Now, of course, the reason for this is because since I'm swapping out control panels, that the Arcade1Up encoder board can no longer be on the control panel. It's going to have to be put on somewhere in the cabinet. So next, I thought I'd actually look at the control panel and actually see what has to be on the control panel. Since I'd be doing multiple control panels, some controls that are repetitive or static that will never change, I can move those off. As an example, for example, the power button. I don't have to have the power button on every single control panel. In fact, I don't want it on the control panel because if I'm making this hot swappable, I want to relocate the power button somewhere off the control panel so the unit stays on when I swap out the control panel. So other than the power button, what other controls can I move off the control panel so I don't have to put those on every single control panel I build? And finally, how to connect the control panel controls to the Arcade1Up encoder. Now, because we moved the encoder on into the cabinet, of course that will hook up to the PCB, but still we have this control panel that we somehow have to get the controls to that PCB. So I have to figure out a way to get those controls connected to the Arcade1Up PCB again so that everything will work properly. So now that I have defined what needs to be done in order to accomplish this, I can now proceed on the solutions to implement so everything's implemented so I can have hot swappable control panels for the Arcade1Up cabinet. And before I proceed with the rest of the video, I should note that the cabinet I'm using, it's a Generation 1 cabinet that's been modded. and it has a Midway Legacy PCB in there. And although the control panels vary from machine to machine, this could be used for pretty much any cabinet. You just have to, probably a few things you would have to do differently, but for the most part it should work for any cabinet. Now I say should because of course I don't have like the new Legacy cabinet. All I have is the Generation 1 cabinet that I'm modding. But again, it generally it should work. You may have to retweak a few things, but for the most part it should work if everything's fouled. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is cut and produce art for the control panel myself. Now I taught myself how to cut control panels, and I also produced the artwork as you can see here. So for this proof of concept, I created 3 control panels. I created a 2-player control panel, a Defender control panel, and a 1-player control panel. In the future I may create more control panels, but for the purposes of this proof of concept I could create 3. Now you may ask yourself, why do I have Mortal Kombat 2 and Street Fighter on the same control panel? Because when I do this for the Capcom Legacy mod that I'm going to do, I'm going to set it up the same way, so theoretically I should be able to swap the control panel from the Midway Legacy to the Street Fighter Legacy. So I only need 1 control panel for both cabinets instead of 2 separate control panels for each cabinet. Now as far as the artwork goes, I printed that on an Epson Workforce WF7720 printer. This printer actually prints out 13 by 19 inch paper, or allows you to print it on that paper. So for the graphics themselves, I found a vendor, Premier Art, that produces 13 by 19 inch adhesive back vinyl. And then I covered that with Contact brand creative covering, self-adhesive, transparent privacy film vinyl, just to protect it so it doesn't get scratched up or anything like that. Now, is the artwork perfect on these? No, not necessarily. Now, you may not be able to see them, but there are imperfections. There's a little bit of bubbling up as far as when I put the contact paper on top of the vinyl. And I'm not perfect in doing artwork. As you can see, that white line there, that's supposed to represent lightning, which I don't think I did a very good job on, but it's passable for me. And it works. Yeah, other vendors can do this better. They have better printers, where they can print the artwork, and things of that nature. But again, for what I need it for, which is again, when I build my Multicade, I'm going to be building out multiple control panels, and I don't want to wait for artwork. And the artwork, and plus I have control of how I want the artwork to look like. When I can print it out, I can test it. If it doesn't look good, I can reprint it, and I can do it relatively quickly. So again, by doing the control panels myself and the artwork myself, although it's not as good as someone who professionally does it, for me, it works for what I need it for, and it looks good enough. So I think I believe I did a good enough job to where I did these control panels, and for what I need it for, and for my Multicade, they will work just fine, and I can reproduce them whenever I want to. I don't have to wait on a third party to produce them. Okay, so next I had to find an alternative for the screws that hold the control panel in place. So the solution I came up with was I found these double roller catch cabinet latches, and I decided to use those to see if those would work in the cabinet. So this is the cabinet with the latches in it, and this is what the latch looks like with the little latch connector on there. So I put it in 4 places. I put 2 in the front and I put 2 in the back. And this is of course going to replace the screws. Now what I did for each one, for the ones in the front, I made sure I screwed them in so they weren't blocking the cutouts here, so that we could put in the kick plate and the J panel back in. As for the screws that are holding these in place, now this package came with screws with them. However, those screws were, I think, 1/2 inch, and they were too long, and they would puncture into the side of the arcade cabinet. So what I used number 6 3/8 inch screws to screw these into the side of the Arcade1Up cabinet to hold them in place. Now on the back of the control panels, I attached the latches on there, lined them up to make sure that they were even so that they would attach in the proper place. Again, I used the number 6 3/8 screws instead of the screws that came with the cabinet latches, or else it would have penetrated the front of the control panel. So basically now I just have to flip the control panel over, move it, and put it on top of those brackets, push it down, and it holds in pretty well. It's in there pretty tight, and it should hold. Okay, so it seems to hold okay, but how about when you're playing the game? Well, here I'm going to demonstrate it right now. So as you can see, I'm pulling on this joystick pretty hard and it's not moving. Now if I pull on it really hard, it's going to pop out. And I mean, I have to pull on it relatively hard to do that. As you can see, the cabinet's shaking around as I'm moving this thing. But again, if I pull down very hard on it, it's going to pop out. But under normal gameplay, you're not going to run into that. And then again, you're going to have to pull on it really hard in order for that thing to pop out. And the same thing for player 2. If I pull down on it really hard, it's going to pop out. But again, at least with me, I'm not going to pull on it that hard to where it's going to come out. But under normal gameplay, like if you're playing a fighting game, you're never going to pull down on it that hard. Now, there may be a way to put something in the back to hold it in place so it doesn't pop out, but for me, the way I play games, I would never pull on it that hard. And if I run into a game where I do have to do that, then I'll figure something else out. But for me, this works fine. And then to pop it out, all I have to do is pull up on the control panel and then get a new control panel and put it in place and pop it in. So for me, this solution is a win for me, and this will work for what I need it for. So now I got to relocate the Arcade1Up encoder board off the control panel and put it in the cabinet. So in order to do that, I cut a piece of wood the length of the cabinet inside and just set it on top of the L and K panel, and then put some cabinet brackets on there so that I can put all my components on the that piece of wood instead of attaching it to the side of the cabinet or the back of the monitor. And so here's the Arcade1Up encoder. Again, instead of being on the control panel, it's inside the cabinet so that I can swap out control panels very easily. As you can see, I have everything hooked up. We'll go over with the other breakout board here in a moment. But I just wanted to show you the encoder board and where it's located at. And again, by putting that in the cabinet itself, it'll allow me to swap out control panels without worrying about the encoder board. So the next step is to find what actually needs to be on the control panel itself. So this picture is a representation of what a Arcade1Up control panel looks like. And you can use, Arcade1Up control panels, that's fine. I'm using custom control panels. So when I build custom control panels, I'm adding controls to them. My thought process is, one, if I'm making it hot swappable, what controls are not needed on every single control panel? In other words, what controls can I take off the control panel and put them on somewhere else on the cabinet so I don't have to keep putting those controls on the control panel itself. So when I look at the Arcade1Up control panel, of course, the joystick and the action buttons, those are always going to be on there, so in one orientation or another. But the buttons that I can take off, the first one is the on-off button. Now I'm gonna have to take that off the control panel because since I want it to be hot swappable, I don't want to have to turn off the machine every time I change out a control panel. So that's gonna have to be relocated. The next button is the volume button. I can take that off and relocate that somewhere else so that I don't have to keep putting that on the control panel. And also the player 1 and 2 buttons. I could keep those on the control panel, but since they're the same across the board, those are just 2 extra buttons I don't need on the control panel. So that just frees up a little bit of real estate on the control panel if I want to relocate the joysticks and the action buttons. So my plan is to take the on-off button switch, that is, the volume switch, and the player 1 and 2 buttons off the control panel and put them somewhere else on the cabinet. Now, as I stated before, you don't have to do that. I mean, if you want to leave all the controls on the control panel, like if you do a Defender control panel for the Midway, if you want to put the on-off volume and the player 1-2 button on that Defender control panel, that's fine too. Just note that if you leave the power on there, that you're going to have to power off the unit and then change out the control panel and turn it on. But just know that you're going to have to, on every single control panel that you do, you're going to have to put an on-off button and a volume switch, which is not hard to do. There are third-party on-off switches and volume switches that you can get instead of the standard Arcade1Up setup. But if you're just using Arcade1Up control panels as they are, then that's fine to leave it like that. It's just your preference. For me, again, I'm making it hot swappable, so on-off volume and the player 1 and 2 buttons will be taken off the control panel. So the question becomes, where am I going to relocate those 4 buttons and switches on the cabinet if they're not going to be on the control panel? I think I've come up with a solution. So here's the cabinet, and as you can see, what I did was I created a panel to put in the front. Now this is a Generation 1 cabinet, so in the front it comes down about 3 1/8 inch and then it angles out and comes down again. So I just made a wood panel, 1/2 inch wood panel that comes down 3 1/8 inch and goes across the cabinet, which is about 17 3/4 of an inch. And then from the inside I put 2 brackets in to hold it in place. So if you look at the front of the panel here, if you can see it, I don't know if this picture gets it, but if you look on the left and the right, there are 2 buttons. On the left is the power button, and on the right is the volume button. These I found these buttons on Amazon, and they're pretty easy to put in. You just have to drill a 13/16 inch hole, and they go right in to the hole, and they pretty much stay pretty sturdy and they don't move around. For the player 1 and player 2 buttons, I got a little bit creative with this. So I bought these light up coin buttons. I bought these from Groovy Game Gear. They're about $11 a piece. I bought them from Groovy Game Gear because you can buy it. You don't have to buy it with a red LED. You can choose which LED you want, and the LED I got was the white LED. And for the artwork on the front of there, it was a 25-cent artwork, I guess, in the button. I printed out the Williams logo with the start player 1 and player 2 on there, and then I just put some artwork on the front of it, printed it out on the Epson printer, and wrapped it with the graphic and wrapped it with contact paper to make it protective. And then for the J panel, it was looking a little bare, so I just covered that with a graphic as well, and did the same thing that I did with the custom panel that I created. So by doing this, these controls, the on-off switch, the volume switch, and the player 1 and 2 are off the control panel and on the cabinet itself. So as you can see, I can plug, I got enough room where I can plug these in now. So basically, all these controls are plugged directly into the Arcade1Up PCB. So now that those are off the control panel, they're static, so I don't have to worry about putting them on the control panel. But again, if you want to leave all those controls on the control panel, that's fine. When I start talking about step 5, you'll see what you'll need to do in order to make sure that all that stuff is reaching the encoder board. So the final step is to find out how to connect the control panel controls to the Arcade1Up encoder. So this is a diagram of what I have so far. We've got the on-off volume player 1 and 2 buttons on the cabinet, and that's plugging directly into the encoder. The encoder we have on the cabinet as well, and that's connected to the Arcade1Up PCB. So now we have the control panel and the encoders on the cabinet, so we have to figure out now how to get the control panel to connect to the encoder board, since that encoder board is no longer on the Arcade1Up control panel. So I found a solution. I found these male header breakout boards on eBay. They are 40-pin 2x20 pin header boards. So my plan is to connect this one to the actual encoder board, and then another one on the control panel itself. So I would have 4 of these all together in my case. One connecting to the Arcade1Up encoder board, and then the other connected onto the back of the control panel, just as the Arcade1Up encoder board used to be. So here's the visual interpretation of what I'm talking about. So when I include the breakout boards, one breakout board will be on the back of the control panel. So the joystick and all the action buttons will plug into that breakout board. Then a 40-pin ribbon cable will be connected to that breakout board that's on the control panel. And that ribbon cable will be connected to the other breakout board that's in the cabinet. And the breakout board cables from there will go into the Arcade1Up encoder board that is in the cabinet now, and then the connection is complete. Now the control panel is connected again to the Arcade1Up encoder board, and the joystick and action buttons will function properly now. Okay, so now I need to connect the breakout board to the Arcade1Up encoder. So the breakout board has its pins numbered 1 through 40 as it's connected with a 40-pin ribbon cable. So in this visual graphic here, on the top left, we have the Arcade1Up encoder. So this is what all the connections on the Arcade1Up encoder look like. As you can see, for where it says G2, that represents Gamer 2 or Controller 2, and G1 represents Gamer 1 or Controller 1. Now we're only concerned with the controllers and the action buttons. We're not worried about the power or the volume or the start buttons, which are indicated by G2 start and G1 start, as I have relocated those buttons to the cabinet, so we're not going to use the breakout board for those. Now for G2 and G1 left right and G2 and G1 down up, those indicate the joysticks, and as you can see, I labeled, there's 4 pins for those, and I labeled those L, R, U, D, which represent left, right, up, down. So for right, left, 2 pins are for the left, 2 pins are for the right, and for up, down, U is for the 2 pins for up, and D represents the 2 pins used for down. So below that is the breakout board assignments. So these are the pins that I use to connect to the Arcade1Up encoder. So as you can see in the first column are pins 1 through 20, and that's for all the Gamer 2 or Controller 2 action buttons and the joysticks. So each button and each left, right, up, down for the joystick uses 2 wires. So each action button and each joystick direction have 2 cables coming out of it, as they're just using micro switches. So for pins 1 through 20, that's for controller 2, and pins 21 through 40, that's for controller 1, and that also includes the action buttons. And the reason why we're starting with the controller 2 on the left side is that I'm following the same format as the Arcade1Up encoder. That just for simplicity's sake, the reason for that is because when you flip over the control panel and you're looking at it upright, player 2 will be on the left side, player 1 will be on the right side. So it just makes sense that when you're wiring that from the breakout board, it goes into the Arcade1Up encoder, that it goes Gamer 2 is on the left and Gamer 1 is on the right, so you don't have wires crisscrossing back and forth. Now this breakout board assignment works for what I'm doing because I'm using custom control panels where I have taken off the power, volume, and the player 1 and 2 start buttons off the control panel. If you decide to leave this player 1 and 2 buttons, the power and the volume, or some combination of that on your control panel, you're going to have to purchase a bigger breakout board to accommodate those additional buttons. So they do sell them in 50 pin as well, So you could do it that way, or you may be able to get away with, as far as the action buttons, although they have two cables coming out for the micro switch, you may only have to use one cable for each pin, and then the second pin can be what for the ground, and you can have all 6 buttons use the same ground, so you can use one pin for all 6 grounds for player 1 and another pin for all 6 grounds for player 2. And by doing that, they may free up enough pins to where you can use the power, the on button, and the player 1 and 2 start buttons. Just something to keep in mind if you're going to keep all the buttons on the control panel. So over to the right are the Street Fighter 2 or Capcom Legacy and the Mortal Kombat 2 or Midway Legacy action button assignments. So if you're looking at the control panel from the top, these are the button assignments that are plugged into the Arcade1Up encoder. And as you can see, that they're mapped pretty much the same way. With the Mortal Kombat 2 block button is G1B, and the second middle button in the second row on the Street Fighter 2 is G1B as well. So they have the same assignments on the encoder board for both games. Now for me, this is important because, as I said previously, my plan is to use the same control panel I'm using for the Midway Legacy for the Capcom Legacy once I start modifying the Capcom Legacy. And on the bottom of that is the Defender button layouts for the Midway Legacy. So as you can see, for player 1 and player 2, reverse, fire, thrust, smart bomb, and hyperspace. Those are the button assignments on the Arcade1Up encoder board, and that's what I use as a reference when I built out my custom control panel for Defender. Okay, so this is a picture of inside my cabinet, and on the top there is the Arcade1Up encoder board, and on the bottom is the 40-pin breakout board. So, and on the breakout board on the top, of course, are the pins that we attach to the Arcade1Up encoder, and then on the bottom is the 40-pin ribbon cable that will go from that breakout board to the breakout board that would be on the control panel to complete the connection. So as you can see here, very simply, as I showed in the graphic, we have, from the breakout board, we have pins 1 through 40 going into the appropriate places on the Arcade1Up encoder. So again, once the 40-pin ribbon cable is connected to the other breakout board on the control panel, again, it completes the connection. So of course the joysticks and all the action buttons work properly on the cabinet. And then of course, if you look, the power, the speaker, and the action button and the start button for player 1 and 2 are not on the breakout board, but they are wired onto the front of the cabinet itself, so that only the joysticks and the action buttons are only coming through on the breakout board from the control panel. So that's pretty much it. It's just wiring it so everything matches as I showed in the graphic, and with that I'll show you the 3 control panels that I made. So this is the first control panel. This is a 2-player control panel, and as I stated earlier, the reason why there's a Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter side is I got a little bit creative, and the fact that I'll probably do the same thing on my Capcom Legacy mod that I'm going to do, so I can use the same control panel on the Mortal Kombat or the Midway Legacy and the Capcom Legacy. So if we flip this over, you'll see that there on the top is where I put the other breakout board, and again the ribbon cable will connect from that to the one that's in the cabinet to complete the connection so that the controls, joysticks, and the action buttons function properly. So you'll notice that my breakout board is a little bit off-centered, so on some of these I had to extend the cables. So I bought these white wire nuts, to extend the wire. So, of course, a wire nut's used to twist over bare ends of wires to make a tight connection, so to make two wires into one. And normally I would do this with, you could just twist them together and use black tape or some other method, but these are actually easier. So as you saw in the first one, I pressed down and put one end of the wire in, and then press the other end and put the other wire in, and therefore it completes the connection. They're a little bit more expensive. You get 3, I think they're like 85 cents. But it saves me time. I don't have to worry about soldering or wiring cables together. And that completes that. So then now we'll move over to the next control panel, which would be the Defender control panel. Okay, so this is the Defender control panel. I tried to make it as close to the original as possible. As you can see, I have I have 2 buttons on the top here. That was for the left and right joystick directions. I didn't know in the main menu at the time if I was going to have to use left and right for menu options, because I kept the joystick as 2-way to go up and down. But it turned out I didn't actually have to have those in there, but I left them on there anyway. So when you flip this over, as you can see, again, we have the breakout board on the top there, and everything's wired in. Now you would think on this all I would have to do is player 1, but I actually had to do both players. And the reason for this is because on the Midway Legacy cabinet, player 1 uses the player 1 joystick and player 2 uses the player 2 joystick. So in a game like Defender, if you select 2 players, player 1's going to work, but if I don't have all the connections there, player 2's not going to work. So this is what I did. So looking at this example here from this, I believe that's the down micro switch. So I have both my cables going into one of these wire nuts, and then coming from the other side, I have 2 cables on each one coming out. So, and one of those wires goes to the player 1 breakout pin, and then the other one goes to the player 2 breakout pin. So in this case, if that's the down micro switch, then I have one of those cables going to the player 1 down, and then another cable going to the player 2 down. And then I did the same thing with all the other action buttons and all the other joystick directions. And by doing this, player 1 and player 2 share the same controls, so I'm now able to play 2 players on the Defender game. Okay, so for the final control panel, this is just a 1-player control panel. And just like with the 2-player control panel, I split the artwork with Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter 2 because, again, I plan to share this control panel between the Midway Legacy and the Capcom Legacy. It's a control panel I may do differently. I was so busy trying to make sure the measurements of the joystick and the buttons match the arcade, it didn't occur to me that I could just spread this out better if I wanted to. So I may redo this control panel to spread out the controls a little bit better. But I have it flipped over now, and again we have the breakout board. And again you see that I have it plugged in not only for player 1 and player 2. And I did the same thing what I did with the Defender, is for each control coming into it with 1 cable for technically positive and negative. Coming out the other end are 2 cables, and 1 plugs into player 1 and 1 plugs into player 2. And this is done because of 2 reasons. One, in the Mortal Kombat games, you may want to select player 2 and play on the right side. So that's why I connected player 1 and player 2 on here, so that they both use the same controls. Also, it is for Wizard of War on the Midway Legacy. Wizard of War, even in the arcade, the right side was player 1. And in this case, that would be the player 2 joystick. So by wiring it to where the controls use both the player 1 and player 2 inputs, I can play Wizard of War, and again, in the Mortal Kombat games, if I wanted to play on the right side, I would select 2-player. So that's it for the control panels I've done so far. So the question becomes, what if I don't have my own custom control panels, and what if I'm using regular Arcade1Up control panels. So where would that breakout board go? Well, the breakout board can go in the place where the old encoder went if you keep the power slash volume assembly in the Arcade1Up control panel. So for example, if you look on the left, that's the control panel with the Arcade1Up encoder in there. So that's held in place on the on-off switch, volume switch assembly with 3 screws on the left and the right and 1 screw on the bottom. So you're going to take that encoder and put it in the cabinet anyway. So if you look on the right, if you leave that assembly in there, even if you decide to put the power and the volume somewhere else on the cabinet, if you're not keeping it on the control panel, if you just keep that assembly in there, you can take the breakout board, as you can see, and on the left and right there's 2 screw holes, and you can screw that into the on-off volume switch assembly to hold it in place. But if you decide to take off the on-off volume assembly, you can still just put the breakout board where that was, flat on the back of the control panel, and then screw it down. Either way, this is the best position to put that breakout board because it's so large. Trying to put it anywhere else just isn't really going to work. So that's going to be the best place to put that on a stock Arcade1Up control panel. So that's about it as far as the steps we have to go to get everything to work. So now I'm going to show you some gameplay and switching the control panels while playing the games. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and test play some games and then swap these control panels around to see how quickly we can do it. So we're going to start by turning on the cabinet. And the first game that we'll go to is Mortal Kombat. And if you look at the screen, you'll see that there's glare coming from the light. I apologize for that in the lower left corner there. It didn't show up when I was playing. It showed up on the camera, so I do apologize for that. But for the most part, the picture, you should be able to see most of the picture and get the idea that the control panels are working and functional, and the ability to hot swap them. So take a moment for Mortal Kombat to come up here. And everything seems to be working properly. Now I'm not very good at fighting games, so I actually won this match, but normally I would probably lose. But anyway, so once this match is done, we'll go ahead and exit the game. Now, to swap out the control panel, I don't necessarily have to exit the game. I just tend to do it just out of habit. But I wouldn't have to exit the game to do the hot swap control panel. I could just change it out and then exit the game and go into the game that I wanted to. So we got that ejected. We're plugging in the Defender control panel now. And once we get that in there, set it on top, push down to put it in place. And as you can see, it was hot swapped. We didn't have to turn off the machine. And everything's working as it should. So now we know everything works. I'll go ahead and exit this game and put in the player 1 control panel. I have a little bit of trouble getting that in. Once you get it lined up, it goes in pretty easily and it pops right in. And for this one, we'll test Wizard of War. now just to make sure that the player 2 joystick's working. And I'm pressing start, and the Wizard of War seems to take a moment for it to load anyway, so there's nothing wrong with my start button, just that takes a moment for it to start. And everything seems to be working properly. So this video was a few minutes long. You saw how quickly I was able to change out the control panels, the hot swap them, and continue with the unit still on and being able to play the games fairly quickly. So that concludes this proof of concept for hot swappable control panels for Arcade1Up cabinet. This project originally, I had an idea for Multicade. I plan on doing later on this year. So I figured I was modding a Midway Legacy, and since I wanted the Defender control panel as arcade accurate as possible, I decided to try this idea on an Arcade1Up cabinet. I wanted to swap the control panel without having to turn the power off, so I came up with 5 things I needed to do for that. 1, I needed to cut and produce art for a control panel myself. I had to find alternatives for the screws that held in the control panel. I had to relocate the Arcade1Up encoder board off the control panel and put it in the cabinet. I needed to decide what controls I wanted to take off the control panel that were not needed for every single control panel. And finally, I had to connect the control panel controls to the Arcade1Up encoder. And I think I succeeded in all those steps. And the way I have this set up, even though this is a proof of concept, I'm going to move forward and set up my machines like this. The brackets that I'm using to hold the control panel in place seem to be good. Now if I really pull down hard on it, the control panel or the joystick, it will pop out the control panel, but I would have to use a lot of force to pull down, and the games that I play, that would never happen. Even if I was using fighting games, it wouldn't happen. So I hope this video was informative. If you have any, and hopefully you don't have to follow everything that's in here, I hope it gives some people, if they want to do this, give them some ideas of how to proceed to do this themselves if they have a different way of doing it. If you do, I'd like to hear from you in the comments and your ideas. And that's about it for this video, and I will see you in the next video.